Harold, how are you? Harold, how are you? Harold,
Yeah, hold on.
there you are. Did you hear me hollering at you?
Yeah, the camera wasn't working. And when the camera doesn't work, it doesn't pick up the microphone.
Oh, okay. So they're incorporated together.
Yep.
Say, have you heard of a company? I think it's called SMR. They're building these small packaged nuclear
Yeah.
reactors.
I think I have, but I really don't keep up with the nuclear industry anymore.
Oh, you don't?
Nope.
I thought that's what you still did.
Mm-mm. Nope. I do military bases, military support corporate companies like Boeing and Lockheed, and some commercial buildings.
What do you mean building support?
Companies like Lockheed and Boeing that build airplanes and munitions.
Oh, I know that.
Or yeah,
So you deal with the structures?
fire protection and life
Oh,
safety.
fire protection.
And I
Okay.
also do some border patrols places these last 6 months.
Oh, that must mean some pretty heavy travel then.
No, actually not. I'm real good at doing stuff remote.
Uh-huh.
So
Well,
no,
that's what.
they're real happy with me staying put most of the time.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah. Well, pretty soon I'll join your ranks. So,
Well, it's a good place to be, I can tell you that.
huh?
It's a good place to be.
Yeah. So we'll
I
see.
I have a number of friends that are just joining the retired ranks, and it's a considerable adjustment. And then pretty soon you get to be retired as long as Sue and I, and you say, what was it like to work?
Oh, I think I'll make myself busy. I just bought myself a welder.
Oh, you did? What kind of welder?
It was on sale. I wanted to buy a Miller, but by the time I would have got all the accessories, it would have been 2 grand.
Mm-hmm.
So I settled for a Northern Tool, their brand called Clutch,
Mm-hmm.
and it does stick, MIG, TIG, and it came with the aluminum spool gun.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I got it all for. Plus, I bought a helmet, um, the little welding hammer,
The
pliers,
gloves?
everything but a gas bottle for less than 750.
Boy.
What are
Did
you
you
going
get
to
that
do,
at Harbor
Harold?
Freight?
Harold, what are you going to do with the welder?
Whatever I want.
I
No, I
understand that,
looked at the
but
Harbor Freight.
what prompted you to buy a welder?
It's on my bucket list, and I have some things needing mending.
Oh, okay.
But I looked at Harbor Freight seriously, the Titan 200, titanium 200. But one, it does, the clutch comes with a 3-year warranty versus the 6 months.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come with the aluminum spool gun, which is another $260.
Yeah.
So, and the Harbor Freight only takes the 4-pound reel. It doesn't take the 10-pound.
Mhm.
So,
So, do you
This-
John,
know
do you
how to
know what he's
use it?
talking about?
Hello, Fred.
hey, Fred.
Hi,
Hey,
Fred.
John. Hi, guys. We talking fishing or?
No, we're talking welding.
Welding.
Oh, okay.
Do you know how to use it, Fred?
Nope.
No.
I'm
Harold, do you know how to
I've been
use it?
watching a lot of videos, and there's two congregants that one's a welding engineer and one's just a knowledgeable person, and I've asked them for help
Yeah.
to get me
I'd
started.
go to the knowledgeable person. You know what happens to an engineer that
Well, actually, he's a welding engineer.
I know you said that, but engineers, we deal with things a little bit differently than the guy who's actually making the
No,
beat.
he actually has an ESAB welder and came over the house and mended some things for me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, he's hands-on.
Yeah, that makes a difference.
Yep. So,
Well, Fred, or Harold, you'll have a lot of fun learning to use that.
well, I'm hoping.
Doesn't sound like fun to me.
As long as he doesn't blind himself, Sue.
Okay, I got it.
You know, I did that when I was about 8 years old. I went to one of the garages where my dad was having his one of the truck bodies custom fabricated. And they were welding, and he said, "Don't look." And what did I do?
That meant look.
It's for about 5 minutes afterwards, it was yeah, not
Yeah,
very good.
no. We all learn the hard way, don't we?
Mm.
Yeah, it's like, don't touch it, it's hot. What do? You
Yeah.
touch it. Is it really hot?
Yeah. That watching that bright arc is like a magnet.
It is.
Mhm.
It's the same thing with these lunar eclipses.
Yeah, sure.
People don't realize, that the sun is still at full strength.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Fred, I sent you a note. I bought that Constantine book.
Oh, you did? Yeah, it's a thick book, but it's really worth reading.
Oh, is it thick?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big book.
It's probably meant for scholars, and that means it's not meant for me.
No. It's readable. But
Okay.
it's a big book and it takes a while to get through, but I think it's worth it. I've read it twice.
Okay. Well, you tickled my interest, and
Mhm.
and the more I thought about it, all the things we saw in Europe and what have you, I'm thinking
Mhm.
he must have had a pretty profound impact on Western society as we know it.
He did. He definitely did. Well, it looks like we have a small group tonight.
Boy,
I have
we
a
do, don't
suspicion.
we?
Yeah, I have a
Small but
suspicion
very
this
good group, Fred.
an elite group,
An
right?
elite group, yeah.
With you, right?
Hungry for learning.
Yeah, I have an idea that this recording business may not have been the best idea. I think a lot of people are just figuring they can always look at it whenever they want to from the recording.
Eh,
That's
Yeah.
not as nearly as much fun as it when it's live.
I
Yeah,
know.
that's right.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Okay. Well, actually, Harold's here now. We can start.
Oh,
Oh,
wait a
okay,
minute.
good.
Yeah.
see, I'm only chopped liver. I might as well
Okay.
go.
all the important people are here now. So
So I don't know where John and Chris are.
maybe they'll join a little later. Okay. Anyway, we were, last week we were talking about Jewish life in Poland, toward the end of the Middle Ages. And one of the major things that came out of that culture in Poland was Hasidism, the Hasidic movement. So I thought we would talk about that a little bit tonight. The term Hasidism has been used several times in Jewish history.
So after we do the toast, and all of a sudden, gets up and says, well, let's go into the car, inside.
Who's got something going on in the background?
Where's that coming from?
It's coming from mine. Let me mute it.
You can mute yourself.
How about that?
That sounds good. Okay.
Okay, I've got Fred.
Yeah, thank you. So, we walk about 10 feet to the end of the patio. And I look up.
Okay, now I think we can start now. Okay. Hasidism, actually, the term has been used a number of times in different ways in Jewish history. The word Hasid really just means a pious person. That was the original meaning. And the
Can you
first time
spell that, Fred? It's called Hausianism.
Hasidism. It's Hasid, but the H is spelled like a gutter, like a H.
Okay.
It's Hasid, Hasidism. Okay. And the first time it was used actually was in the 2nd century BCE, when the Maccabees revolted against Greek rule. The Hasidim were the pious ones. They were the ones who refused to assimilate to Greek culture. They were the ones who joined the Maccabees to fight, to maintain their own religion, their own way of life. So that was the first time it was used. It was used again in medieval Europe, basically by groups of scholars who would devote their lives to mysticism, to studying Kabbalah. And these were secret societies. Kabbalah was felt to be a secret that most ordinary Jews couldn't get into, and only very special people, could understand it. So there were small societies of what were called Hasidim, all through Europe. But the way it's used now, the modern meaning, began in Poland in the 17th century, and that's the Hasidism, that we have today. And it resulted from a variety of factors coming together. One was what we mentioned before, the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648. That decimated the Jewish populations, especially of southern Poland, and it left it really in a state of chaos, with most of the governing structures, really having been destroyed. There was another factor that came into it also, and that there was a split within the Jewish community. Jews have always valued education. It's always been one of the highest Jewish values. And scholars have always been revered in the Jewish tradition. But it's possible to take a good thing too far. You can have too much even of a good thing. And one of the things that developed was particularly in the north of Poland, in what we now call Lithuania, where there were major Talmudic academies. A lot of the other scholars began to look down on ordinary Jews, who were not learned, who had no Jewish education. The term that they would use is Am Haaretz. And Am Haaretz really began in Hebrew, simply means the people of the land. And to begin with, it was a positive term. The first time that Am Haaretz was used, it was in the book of Genesis when Sarah dies, and Abraham has to find land for a burial plot for her. And so he goes to the Hittites, the people, who owned the land at the time. And that's the first time he goes to the Am Haaretz, to the people of the land, and in order to negotiate with him to buy some land for Sarah's burial plot. So initially, Am Haaretz was actually a positive term. Later on, though, particularly during the Greco-Roman period, it began to be used by some of the rabbinic scholars to describe Jews who are not learned. And basically, in Yiddish, and by the 17th century, it got mashed together into one word, Amaretz. And it really was kind of the Yiddish equivalent of redneck. If you were calling somebody Amaretz, it means they were uneducated, unlearned, didn't know any Talmud. And and many of the learned Jews in northern Poland, Lithuania, would apply this to the southern Jews, whose communities had really been broken up by the massacres. Um, and a lot of Jews simply felt left out of Judaism. The idea was if you weren't learned, you weren't a good Jew. And Hasidism grew out of that environment. And the man who's given the credit for beginning it, the man who founded Hasidism, was a man named Israel ben Eliezer. And he was born in a little village in southern Poland around 1700. His parents died when he was very young, and as an orphan, he was kind of raised as a ward of the community. Um, when he got a little bit older, he made his living as a teacher for young children in the Hebrew school. He was a caretaker for the synagogue there. Sometimes he worked as a day laborer, but he always was noted to have a mystical streak. He would sometimes just go off for hours at a time into the forest or into the field just to meditate and have visions. He apparently had a very charismatic personality. People were drawn to him. And he actually practiced faith healing, which was a very, very common practice in those days. And faith healers were called Baal Shems, which Baal Shem means a master of the name. In other words, they were able to use mystical knowledge of God in order to heal people. And that's one of the things that he did. Um, he also had a real talent for talking to simple people in parables, talking to unlearned people in terms that they could understand and be impressed by. And that way, really, when you read accounts of his early life, he sounds a lot like Jesus, really, talking to simple people in parables. Um, he never published any of his writings, and he really never wrote anything. We have a few letters by him, but he never wrote anything about himself, about his own life, and never wrote any of his teachings down. So really, what we know about him really comes from stories that his later disciples, wrote about him, and so you have to take it with a grain of salt. These were people who all revered him at that point, and so you really have to take a grain of salt with how they describe his life. Um, he lived almost all his life in a village in southern Poland. He never traveled much. He never wrote anything down, and probably Hasidism would have died with him if it weren't for some of the people that visited his village. And one of the ones who did was a man named Dov Bear Friedman. Dov Bear Friedman was what was called a Maggid, and which really basically means a storyteller. And these Maggids were very common in Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. In a traditional Orthodox synagogue, there's really no sermon. The rabbi may make a few remarks, a few commentaries on the Torah portion that's going to be read that week, but there's no real preaching as such. And the Magidim really were sort of itinerant preachers. They would go from one congregation to another, and they were very charismatic speakers, and rabbis would invite them to talk to their congregations, kind of almost like a revival. And Dov Bear really was one of the best known, one of the most famous of all the Magidim. He was kind of a Billy Graham of southern Poland, during the early 18th century, and he happened to be going through the Baal Shem's village, spent a few days with him, and really got impressed with his teachings. And he was the one who really started to spread Hasidism all through Poland, and later on through the rest of Eastern Europe. Um, and it was really very effective. But by the early 19th century, Hasidism had spread all over Eastern Europe. And it's estimated by the end of the 19th century probably half the Jews in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Hungary, Romania, about half of all these Jews were probably Hasidim at that point. It never really spread to Western Europe because the Western European Jews were busy assimilating. They got into the 18th century European Enlightenment. A lot of them, were looking to assimilate it into the wider society, and Hasidism really had no appeal for them. But it really spread like wildfire all through Eastern Europe. And the teachings of Hasidism, one was something called davakut. And davakut really is a Hebrew word that means clinging. In modern Israeli Hebrew, devek is the word for blue. But davakut really means clinging to God. And it describes a mystical union with God, which is really a very innovative thing in Judaism. The old rabbis never taught that. Their teaching was all you have to do is follow God's commandments. He's God and you're not. You're not gonna become one with God. They were not mystics, but that's what Hasidism taught. The object of a lot of Hasidic practices was actually a mystical union with God, which is really a new concept in Judaism. It's not something that the classic rabbis ever taught. The second thing was that God was in everything. You could worship God in all sorts of different ways, not necessarily by studying Talmud. You could worship God by singing, by dancing, even by eating or drinking. Any act could bring you closer to God if it were done in the right spirit. So that an Amaha Aretz, an uneducated Jew, could get just as close to God as the greatest Talmud scholar. It was really a matter of attitude, the way you approached it. And the emphasis was really more on emotion. And it's not so much on what you knew or what you said, it was the emotion that you brought to your prayers that really made a difference. It was really more of an emotional, personal approach to Judaism than the classic rabbis and Talmud scholars had been teaching. And actually, there were parallel movements going on in Christianity at about the same time, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. For instance, Methodism, which really grew up in England in the early 19th century. We don't consider Methodists as being wild and crazy people or mystics today, but actually in England in the early 19th century, where Methodism started, the standard way to worship was the Anglican Church, and that was very, very formal worship, very, very, very staid, very formal. It was really geared toward the aristocracy. People even sat in church according to their rank in society. Um, and the Wesley brothers who began Methodism would have these big outdoor revival meetings. They would sing hymns for hours. Most of their followers were working class people, and it really scandalized the Anglicans. Methodists were originally looked on as a bunch of crazy people. But what they wanted was something that appealed to ordinary people and appealed to the emotions as much as it did to the intellect. You also have the Quakers arising during the same time, and their teaching was you should be guided by the inner light, not by formal teachings of any kind. You had to follow your inner light. The Mennonites in Germany began about the same time. So there were a number of Christian sects who began at about the same time, really emphasizing the same thing. Emotion was more important than reason or learning. What they wanted was a personal emotional experience in religion. The other thing which marked Hasidism was the use of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, and it has roots that go all the way back to the Greco-Roman period. But Kabbalah was not something for ordinary people. It was a special kind of study. Only certain scholars could approach it. Ordinary people didn't get into Kabbalah. But the Hasidic people, the Kabbalah was for everybody, and Kabbalistic teachings could be used in everyday Jewish practice. And the Kabbalah they were talking about was what is called Lurianic Kabbalah. And this referred to the Kabbalah developed in Safat in northern Israel. Remember, we talked about the Sephardic Jews, when they were expelled from Spain in 1492, a small group of scholars ended up in Safat in northern Israel, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, at that time. And they developed the Kabbalah Study Center there. They were all Sephardic Jews, except for except for their leader, who came from Egypt, and he was Isaac Luria, a very charismatic character who organized this Kabbalistic group. Uh, and he taught what he called practical Kabbalah, which really sounds kind of like an oxymoron. How can you have practical mysticism? But what he was talking about was, the Kabbalah before was just an intellectual exercise. You studied it as an interesting thing to study, or you might try to use some Kabbalistic practices, to bring yourself closer to God, to try to get to this mystical union with God. But Isaac Luria taught that Kabbalah could actually have practical uses in the world. In other words, you could actually bring the Messiah sooner by certain Kabbalistic practices. And a good example is one of the groups of people that have picked this up are the Lubavitcher Hasidim, which are one of the more prominent Hasidic groups, today. And in big cities like New York, where there are large numbers of them, particularly in New York, they have what are called mitzvah mobiles. And these mitzvah mobiles are vans. And what they'll do is they'll drive to a street corner in Midtown Manhattan. They're looking for unobservant Jews, that they can influence and draw back toward Judaism. And if you're looking for unobservant Jewish men, Midtown Manhattan's probably a great place to start. It's what the military calls a target-rich environment. And the Lubavitchers have what's called Judar. They can often kind of detect whether somebody's Jewish or not. And what they'll do, they'll park their van, on the street there, go out and go up to people that are passing by and ask them, are you Jewish? And, in Midtown Manhattan, on a typical day, there's about a 50% chance a guy will say yes. And the next thing they'll ask is, have you put on tefillin today? Tefillin are these phylacteries that religious Jews put on every morning on their arm and on their head when they pray the morning prayers. And there's about a 90%, 95% chance the guy will say no. And so what they'll do is they'll talk him into coming into their van and show him how to put tefillin on, go through this with him, and recite the proper prayers with him. Now, from a practical point of view, this, from a rational point of view, this seems to be totally pointless. What could possibly be the point of getting some poor guy to go through some ritual that he really doesn't understand or believe in? And the answer the Lubavitcher Hasidim will often give you if you ask him about this is, well, you never know. If he does it once, he might be inspired to do it again. There's about a 0.1 chance, that's going to happen. The reason they're really doing it is a Kabbalistic reason, because in Kabbalah, when you do a mitzvah, intention and understanding aren't what are important. All that's important is that you did it. It doesn't matter why you did it or whether you really understand, what the mitzvah means or not. The important thing is you did it, and that causes reverberations in the upper worlds, and the Messiah is a couple of steps closer. So that's their approach to Kabbalah. The other thing that makes them very different from other Orthodox Jews is their rabbis. A Hasidic rabbi is called a Rebbe, and he's also called a tzaddik. Tzaddik basically just means a righteous person, but to the Hasidim, a tzaddik is a special person. He's somebody who has a close, intimate relationship with God, more than ordinary Jews do. So he can intercede directly with God for his congregation. And this really goes against mainstream Jewish teaching. The old rabbis always taught that no Jew, no matter how learned or pious he is any closer to God than any other Jew. All Jews are equal that way. But the Hasidim really believe that their rebbes their tzaddik really has a special relationship with God. And he can intercede with God. He can even do miracles. There are all sorts of stories among the Hasidim of all the miraculous things that their rebbes can do. And in these Hasidic groups, you don't make any major life decision without getting your Rebbe's approval first. Who you marry, how many children you should have, what profession or job you should work at, whether you should move from one place to another. You don't do any of these things without running it by your Rebbe first. Um, well, I did my residency at a hospital in New York City where we used to get Hasidic patients occasionally. And usually we would, when we were working them up, we would tell the family, these are the things that we need to do. And they would say, write it down. And we had to write it all down because they had to take it back to the Rebbe that night and get his approval. And then they would come in the next morning and the Rebbe said, okay. And then they would sign the consent forms and we'd go ahead. And actually, we worked them up and treated them like any other patient. It's just that everything ran on this overnight delay because you had to get the Rebbe's approval, before you did anything. The funny thing was, I think they did better than most of our other patients. Not that the Rebbe's had any mystical powers, but patients who have a positive attitude and have confidence in the care they're getting do tend to do better. And I don't know how much confidence they had in us, but they had absolute faith in the Rebbe. And if he was signing off on what we were doing, then everything was going to be okay. Um, and one of the most famous of all the Rebbe's in the modern world was the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who had his headquarters in Brooklyn. And he had probably about 30,000 followers, in the New York metro area who really worshipped him in fact, he died in the 1970s, and his grave is in Queens, and there's still Lubavitchers who keep a 24-hour watch on his grave. Some of them, they want to be there if he returns. He's they really many of them really believe that he was the Messiah. And again, you can see in Lubavitcher Hasidim, how they use Kabbalah. One of the things that the Lubavitcher Hasidim are identified by are these Chabad houses that they follow. That's the name of their philosophy, Chabad. And it really comes from Kabbalah. When the Kabbalists believe that the world was created by 10 emanations from God, these are the attributes of God that radiated out, to create the world. And 3 of those attributes of God are wisdom, discernment, and knowledge. And in Hebrew, wisdom is chokhmah, discernment is binah, knowledge is da'at. So the letters, and chokhmah is chet, binah begins with a beit, da'at dalid. So you have het, beit, dalid, which is the acronym that forms Chabad. It's formed from this Kabbalistic idea that 3 of the attributes of God that he used in creating the world. Then the Hasidim really were almost totally obliterated during the Second World War because they were in the parts of Eastern Europe that were really hardest hit by the Holocaust. It's estimated probably 85 to 90% of all the Hasidim died during the Holocaust. And that really, you think, would have been the end of the movement. But amazingly, a lot of the survivors who made it to America after World War II managed to reconstitute their families there. And Hasidism actually took off again in America. Right now, it's the most rapidly growing segment of Judaism in America are these Hasidic groups. It is not necessarily because of their ideology. They do attract a few Jews from outside, who are impressed by their way of life. They call them Baal Teshuva, those who return, people who return to a pious way of life. But the main reason they're growing really is their lifestyle. They follow a very traditional lifestyle. They marry very young. They have a lot of kids. And if you have 7 or 8 kids, you grow a lot from generation to generation. So they really have become a force to contend with. And again, the reason is really more biological than it is ideological. They just have a lot of kids.
But aren't they
Yeah.
still, I don't have
Mhm.
a politically correct word, snobbish, unless you,
Yeah, they are actually.
unless, I mean, if you're a convert or you come from the Reform, you're really not part of that elitism.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, in fact, it's really ironic. You know, Hasidism began partly as a protest against the elitist Talmud scholars, you know, in Lithuania, who looked down on a lot of the poor, uneducated Jews. But then they kind of formed an elite of their own. Most people have never met Hasidic Jews from most of the Hasidic groups because they don't really mix with other Jews. I mean, they don't mix with secular society at all. They keep to themselves and their own communities, but they also don't have much to do with other Jews. The only exception really are the Lubavitch Hasidim, because their Rebbe, his idea was that the Lubavitch Hasidim should be missionaries to other Jews, you know, to bring them back to a more observant way of life. And so as the Lubavitchers would set up these Chabad houses, you know, and reach out to other Jews. But they're really the exceptions. Most of the other Hasidic groups don't really have anything to do with anything outside of their own groups. And they don't really talk to other Jews. So the Lubavitchers really are an exception. In fact, probably the most standoffish group are the Satmar Hasidim, and they get their name from Satmar, which is a village in Hungary that they come from. And they basically just don't talk to other Jews. They're also the only Jewish group really that is strongly anti-Zionist. You know, that they don't believe that there should be a Jewish state in Israel. And the reason is that the wrong people are doing it. You know, the early Zionist pioneers who built up the land and laid the foundation for the Zionist state, most of them are not religious Jews. And so basically the Satmar Hasidim say that Israel is an unclean land because it was built by a bunch of atheistic Jews. And that they have nothing to do with it. They refuse to support the state of Israel at all. A lot of the other Hasidic groups are kind of somewhere in between. So really the only Hasidic group that really has a positive image among most other groups are really all the Lubavitcher Hasidim, because they actually actively reach out to other Jews, unobservant Jews. But even they have their limits. For instance, the Hasidim will not accept converts. They really don't believe in conversion. They believe you know, that basically they're directly descended from Abraham, and anybody who's not directly descended from Abraham cannot be a Jew. You can't accept converts. They also don't believe, even though they really are very nice to other Jews, the Lubavitchers are, they don't believe that our services are really acceptable Jewish services. For instance, if you know the Chabad Rebbe here in Greenville, you know, Rabbi Kesselman, who really is a nice guy. I've been over at his house several times and gone to a couple of his services, but you will never see him set foot in Beth Israel. He can't. You know, according to Beth Israel is not a real synagogue as far as he's concerned, and he's not allowed to be involved in any of our services. It's so there are limits even to what the Lubavitcher Hasidim will do.
Fred, why don't they think they're real services and that we're real Jews?
They just don't. That's part of their teachings.
Will he go? But he will go to the reforms. He will go to the temple, right?
No, he will not. He will not attend a temple service. In fact, I remember, you know, you may have known the previous Chabad Rebbe before Rabbi Kesselman came, Adam Goodfriend. You know, and Adam Goodfriend, I really had a good relationship with. That's when my wife Sandy was still alive. And, you know, we spent a lot of time at their house. We were fairly close to him. But, you know, when she died, we had a Shiva minion at my house. He came over to the house, but he refused to join in the davening. He sat in the kitchen while we had the minion in the living room. He refused to take part in it. He wasn't allowed to. It's just one of their teachings.
Fred, is there a
Yeah.
structure to that sect? I mean, when you say they're not allowed, is it is just the way they
Well,
teach person
it's
to
the
person?
teachings of their rebbes, yeah. The interesting thing is, you know, what really made the movement grow were these charismatic rebbes, these really charismatic leaders who attracted people to them. A lot of the groups go on though even without them. Like the last Lubavitcher Rebbe died in the late 1970s. The movement is now run by sort of the committee of senior rabbis. They don't really have a Rebbe anymore, and yet they're still able to go on. But apparently, their last Rebbe is the one who really formed the movement. He was the one who started the Chabad houses, the whole idea of them reaching out to other Jews and trying to bring them back, to a more observant way of life. That was Rabbi Schneerson, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he apparently was a very, very charismatic guy. There's a story, when after Ed Koch was mayor of New York, when he wrote his memoirs, he has a chapter where he talks about the first time that he ran for mayor in New York, his first campaign. And one of his campaign advisors came to him and said, you really ought to go over to Brooklyn and pay your respects to Rabbi Schneerson. If he likes you, he's got 30,000 Hasidim who vote like one man. So Koch said, okay, set it up. And they did. And the evening that he had the appointment over there, he was waiting in the anteroom to the Rebbe's office. And one of the young assistant rabbis was waiting there with him. And he said, is this your first visit to the Rebbe? And Koch said, yes, it is. And the rabbi said, oh, you'll remember this for the rest of your life. We have famous people from all over the world who come to see the Rebbe. We have famous scientists who come out and they'll say, you wouldn't believe what this man knows about physics. We have famous musicians who come here to see him. When they come out, they'll say, you wouldn't believe what this man knows about music. And he went on and on like that. And finally, the time came, for Potts to see the Rebbe. The young rabbi ushers him into the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe gets up from behind his desk, comes out and shakes hands with him, and motions him to a chair. And sits down behind his desk and motions to him to start talking. And Koch introduces him, tells him who he is, a little bit about himself, and why he wants to be mayor of New York and what he thinks he can do for the Jews in New York. And all this time, the Rebbe never says a word. He just nods and smiles and motions for Koch to keep talking. This goes on for about 20 or 30 minutes. And finally, the Rebbe stands up to indicate, the interview is over. He shakes hands with Koch again and escorts him to the door. But, by this time, word has gotten around the whole neighborhood that Ed Koch is visiting the Rebbe. And so people from all over the neighborhood are gathered around outside the Rebbe's house. So when Koch walks outside, everybody crowds around him, what did the Rebbe say to you? What did you say to the Rebbe? What did you learn from the Rebbe? What did the Rebbe say? And Koch is thinking as fast as he can. He says, oh, you wouldn't believe what that man knows about politics. But the Hasidim are really like the other ultra-Orthodox Jews, and that they really separate themselves from the secular world completely. If you go into say Rabbi Kesselman's house, there's no radio, there's no television. If you have a computer, most of the internet is blocked off. They don't go to the movies, they don't go to the theater. They homeschool their own children. Basically they're like other ultra-Orthodox Jews in that they reject the secular world completely. That they live really in their own insular world. The only difference with the Lubavitcher Hasidim from the other Hasidim is that they're willing to talk to other Jews, which a lot of the others really are not. So. But if you've ever been to a Hasidic Sabbath observance, a Shabbos dinner with them, or to a Hasidic service, you can see the emotional element. There's a lot of singing and dancing, sometimes a lot of drinking goes on also. And the idea really is an emotional approach to Judaism. By singing and dancing and being happy, that's really how you commune with God, not just by studying Talmud. It was kind of a revolt against the overemphasis on study that came about in a lot of the yeshivas of Eastern Europe. Anybody have any other comments or questions at this point? Okay.
Fred, has that,
Yeah.
have they spread through other parts of the US, like to say San Francisco or Los Angeles? Or...
Yeah, you'll find them in all the big cities. In any city like New York, Boston, Baltimore, Cleveland, Philadelphia, you'll find a Hasidic community there. The interesting thing is, where the largest Hasidic community used to be was in New York City, especially in Brooklyn. But one of the problems is, with real estate values in New York just going through the roof, a lot of them can no longer afford to be there. And so they really are being forced out of New York City. And there are Hasidic communities that are growing in upstate New York, in rural areas actually, and in a lot of areas of northern New Jersey. In fact, one real estate agent in northern New Jersey, wrote about her experience with them. He said, she'd been doing real estate for 30 years, but she never had an experience like that. One of the representatives from one of the Hasidic groups that was moving to northern New Jersey, called her and said, "I need to buy 45 houses." So that was a brand new experience. Well, in these groups, everybody has to live, within walking distance of their synagogue. Nobody can live any further than that. So they can't just buy one house. They've got to pretty much take over a whole area, to establish their community. And she said it was one of the most interesting experiences she's ever had in the real estate industry, trying to put together 30 or 40 houses at a time, to sell to these people.
Fred, how large is the Hasidic community in Greenville?
Well, there's not a community, but we have a Hasidic Rebbe. And these Hasidic Rebbes who go to the smaller towns, to settle, they call them shaluchim, which means the ones that are sent. They're actually are missionaries in a sense. Just like Christians would send missionaries to darkest Africa, to try to convert the Africans there. They sent people to them. Greenville is like darkest Africa. There's no Hasidic community there, but people like Rabbi Kesselman, volunteer to go there, set up a Chabad house, and try to bring Jews like us closer to what they consider true Judaism. And basically, they have these Chabad houses in almost everywhere you can imagine. Like Rabbi Kesselman, who's the Chabad Rebbe here, he's one of 10 children, and which is very typical in Hasidic families. And he has two brothers. One of them runs a Chabad house in Buenos Aires, and the other runs a Chabad house in Malmo in Sweden. So it's kind of a thing they take on themselves.
Fred, I think that's the group that has a facility near where I live in McAllen.
I'm sure there's a Chabad house in McAllen.
Yeah.
If we ever have a colony on the moon, you can bet there's going to be a Chabad house there. Yeah. I mean, they're just like that, but they are really tough people. Like Rabbi Kessler was telling me, that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Malmo in Sweden because it's a place where a lot of Middle Eastern, Syrian, Arab refugees have settled. And his brother actually has been beaten up on the street several times, but he stays there and he still keeps the Chabad house open. They're tough people. In Russia during the 1920s and 30s, when Stalin was ruling Russia, and all religious teaching was forbidden, the Hasidim in Russia, the Lubavitchers, still kept an underground system of schools going. A lot of them were in and out of Stalin's prisons all during this time, but they wouldn't give it up. They really are on a mission from God. They're really tough people.
Well, that's to be admired. Does a Rebbe, is that a full-time job, or do they have other professions and then?
No, for most of us, it's a full-time thing. And basically, they don't have a regular synagogue organization. They don't charge anybody dues. And the interesting thing is a lot of them are very well financed because there are a lot of wealthy, non-observant Jews that give them a lot of money. The psychology behind that's kind of strange. But apparently there are a lot of people that are saying, well, I don't want to live that way, but I'll pay somebody else to. You know,
I mean,
even though they're not observant Jews themselves, they're willing to give a lot of money to these people, you know, to live an observant life.
yeah, because where we live, there's no identifying markings of anything that you would think it was anything other than maybe a day school or something like that, or there's
You know,
people
it's
back in,
very unpretentious.
yes,
You know, they don't build big synagogues, you know, the way other
yeah,
Jews
that's right.
do. Usually the synagogue will be in their own house. They'll use their own house as the synagogue. Or, for instance, here in Greenville, they took over one of the BB&T branches out on North Main Street here in Greenville. You know, when they merged with SunTrust to form Truist, you know, BB&T closed a few of their branch offices, and the Lubavitchers here in Greenville took it over. You know, it's just they took over the small bank branch building and you know and took it. That's their synagogue, really. It's what they have their services. Yeah. And actually, in Israel, you know, they're the only group of Hasidim that really do participate to a certain extent. You know, the other ultra Orthodox Jews there, you know, it's really a problem in Israel because you know they don't work, they don't pay taxes, they don't serve in the military, which really you know causes a lot of resentment with other Israelis. And the Lubavitchers actually do. Some of them actually do serve in the military. They actually make an effort to some extent to integrate into Israeli life.
Fred, um, I know that you said that some of the Hasidic will not allow you to become Hasidic, but we did have a person in Greenville, Ronnie Kaplan, that did become Hasidic. So how did he get into the group?
Oh no, if you're a Jew, you can be accepted as a Hasidic Jew, but you have to be born a Jew. They will not accept a convert.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
If you
Jeff,
convert to Judaism, you know they won't accept you as a Hasidic Jew.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah. And they get people from more sort of strange backgrounds. Like, you know, the Hasidic Rebbe we had in Greenville, Rabbi Goodfriend, you know, who came before Rabbi Kesselman did, had a really interesting story in that he grew up in Scarsdale, you know, the suburbs of New York, to a totally secular Jewish family. You know, they didn't belong to a synagogue. He got no Jewish education at all. He didn't have a bar mitzvah. You know, his parents were just not into Judaism at all. He went to a private school in New York City. And then when he went to college, he went to Oberlin. And he said during his junior year at Oberlin, he just went through the spiritual crisis. He said his life just didn't seem to make any sense to him anymore. You know, he just felt totally lost. And he actually did a systematic study of all the religions of the world and somehow ended up deciding he wanted to be a Hasidic Jew. And actually, we kind of liked him because, you know, he grew up like we did, you know, in the normal world. So we could kind of talk to him. You know,
Right.
he knew what our world was like because he wasn't born into a Hasidic family. So, you know, Rabbi Goodfriend, I kind of liked him because you could talk to him about things outside of religion. Kesselman, you really can't because, you know, he's like a third or fourth generation Hasidic Jew. He really doesn't know much about the outside world at all. You know, it's he just was never exposed to it really.
Thank you.
And it's interesting in Europe today, you know, Jewish life in Europe was almost totally destroyed by the Holocaust, and it's just begun to revive over the last few decades. And most of all the revival is being done by the Hasidim. These Hasidic groups, you know, have gone back to Europe, you know, where they started out from in the first place, and they're the ones who are building synagogues and building Chabad houses and really reviving, you know, Jewish learning after the Holocaust in Europe. And most of what Jewish life there is in Europe today really is influenced by the Hasidim. They're the ones who are doing all the rebuilding. Um,
Hmm.
the, um, um, And just to sort of tie up loose ends, if you're following in the outline, on page 15, we're talking about some of the other Jewish groups, in the late Middle Ages as you start getting toward the modern era. Um, the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, because a lot of these were refugees from Spain. When the Jews were driven out of Spain in 1492, um, most of the land that the Arabs had initially conquered, all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, was now part of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs have been defeated by the Ottoman Turks. So even though, this empire was still Muslim, it was no longer Arab. And the Ottoman sultans actually welcomed the Jews. And the Ottoman Empire not only included North Africa and the Middle East, it also included lots of Southern Europe, what's now Bulgaria, Romania, parts of Hungary, the Balkans, and Greece were part of the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of Jewish settlements sprung up over there in the Balkans, in Greece, in Turkey itself, in Istanbul and other Turkish cities. We mentioned a group of Kabbalists who set up shop Safat in Israel and all through northern Africa. The other places where Jews settled was in Italy, and you think that was the last place they would want to settle. That was given the attitude of the church toward the Jews. But actually, in the late Middle Ages, particularly during the Renaissance, the Renaissance popes were not really very religious people. These were the Medici and Borgia popes who were really more interested in collecting art and having a good time than they were in persecuting Jews. So there were a number of Jewish communities that grew up in Italy, during this time. And of course, the only place in Western Europe there was really any significant Jewish settlement was in the Netherlands. For some reason, the Netherlands were the one tolerant place in Western Europe that would allow the Jews to live there after they'd been kicked out of England and out of France and out of most of the German states. There was a Jewish community in the Netherlands. And this was really where the philosopher Spinoza came from. And it's also where the English Jews really came from. The English Jews had been expelled by Edward I in 1290. But in the 17th century, one of the leaders of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam decided to go visit Oliver Cromwell and see if he could persuade him to let the Jews come back to settle in England. And it was a good time to do that because the English Puritans, Cromwell's people, were really interested in the Jews in a sense because they consider themselves the new Jews. If you read the writings of our Pilgrim Fathers, the people who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, people like John Winthrop and John Alden, they really consider themselves as really reenacting the Exodus. Their Pharaoh was the King of England, who was the head of the Anglican Church, who was persecuting them in England, and they were crossing the sea to live by God's law, in a new promised land. So that they really considered themselves the new Jews. And if you look at what they named their kids, in addition to the usual English names, John and Henry and Edward and Richard, there are a lot of Jeremiahs and Isaiahs and Jedediahs and Ezekiels in there also. They were really taken with the Old Testament. And to them, the Jews were kind of interesting Old Testament fossils. And it might be interesting to have them in England again. The other reason probably that Cromwell was interested in bringing the Jews back is that in the 17th century, there was a trade war going on between Holland and England, and the Dutch were winning. And Cromwell suspected the Sephardic merchants in Amsterdam, may have had something to do with that. And it might be a good idea to have some of them in London. And so what he did was he got a committee together of lawyers and bishops and put two questions to them. Number one, was it legal to have the Jews in England again? Was Edward the First expulsion order still in force? And if it wasn't, was it a good idea to have them back? Should we have the Jews back in England? And the answer they gave him was that Edward the First edict was not ratified by his parliament. So it was a personal edict, and when he died, it was no longer in force. So there was no formal legal barrier to the Jews coming back to England. On the second question, whether the Jews should come back to England, they sort of split on that. They couldn't come to a conclusion. And Cromwell decided to take that as a yes. And he invited these Amsterdam Jews to come to England to settle, which many of them did. And so a Sephardic Jewish community grew up in London and other parts of England during the late 17th century. Prior to that, there really was no Jews in England from 1290, really until the late 17th century, which is kind of interesting because, if you read Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, that really was one of the things that formed the anti-Semites' image of Jews. They were usurers, they were Monday lenders. And basically Shakespeare, there's no way Shakespeare could have ever met a Jew. There were no Jews in England, at least Jews that admitted it openly during Shakespeare's time. He just took his ideas, from the ideas that were floating around in the air at the time. He didn't have to actually know any Jews, to absorb anti-Semitic ideas. The only Jew who he might have known about, there was a Marrano named Rodrigo Lopez. He was a Jewish physician, and he was one of the ones who had converted, to Catholicism in order to stay in Spain. Although he would probably practice Judaism secretly, and he was given to Queen Elizabeth by Philip II of Spain as kind of a goodwill gift. He was given to Queen Elizabeth as her personal physician. And a group of people at her court started a rumor about him that he was trying to poison the Queen. And that's why he was really there. He was convicted of treason, and he was drawn, and quartered in front of a big crowd, in London. Shakespeare might have been there to see that. But that was probably the only Jew that he had ever personally had any kind of contact with at all.
So
But it
Fred,
didn't stop him from creating Shylock and the Merchant of Venice.
you're saying that with Oliver Cromwell, then the Jewish population in England was really brought back from the Netherlands as a commercial decision rather
Probably
than
that's really what was in Cromwell's mind. Yeah,
that was driving it rather than anything else.
probably. Yeah, yeah. A lot of his people, even though they thought themselves to be the new Jews, as far as they were concerned, the old Jews, weren't really important anymore. They were the new Jews now. That was a common belief really in the church all through the Middle Ages. It's what the formal name for it was supersessionist theology. In other words, the Jews were the first ones, to recognize the one true God, and you have to give them credit for that. But they were superseded by Christianity. In other words, the Messiah came in the form of Jesus, and the Jews were either too blind to recognize him, or else they really knew that he was the Messiah, but they were too stiff-necked and stubborn, to accept it. And therefore, Judaism, in a sense, was obsolete. It had been superseded by the new revelation, the coming of the Messiah in the person of Jesus. So Judaism, in a sense, was an obsolete religion. It had no purpose anymore. The Jewish prophets were their main job was to predict the coming of Jesus. Other than that, there was really no reason to study them particularly. Judaism kind of was an obsolete religion, sort of an intermediate step in the formation of Christianity. So, any questions, comments about what we covered tonight? Okay. Well, next week we'll talk about the end of the Middle Ages and the Jews in the modern world. What happened, when the 18th century European Enlightenment happened and the impact that had on Judaism.
Right. Thank you, Fred.
Hey,
See you all next week.
Yeah.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Fred. Enjoyed it.
See you guys later. Okay. Let's see, no, cancel.